Welcome to the Unconventional Path, Entrepreneurship and Innovation Stories and Ideas. Hi, I'm Bela Musitz, coming to you from the Capital Region campus of Clarkson University in Schenectady, New York. I'm a former three-time entrepreneur, venture capitalist, and now the retired David D. Ray Professor of Innovation and Entrepreneurship at Clarkson University.
And coming to you from Münster, Germany, I'm Mike Wacholder, Professor of International Management at the Münster University of Applied Sciences. Thanks for joining us today. We hope you enjoy listening to us as much as we've enjoyed putting this together. Many of you ask why we do this, and it's certainly not to make money. The two of us both like to learn from smart and interesting people about how the world is changing, and specifically how innovation and entrepreneurship are changing. We overlay our observations and compare them with the lessons that we've both learned over 3+ decades as entrepreneurs, investors, managers, and professors. To do this, we've put together our network of interesting friends, former students, and business partners, along with other people we've met more recently, to bring you interesting stories, ideas, and insights into innovation, entrepreneurship, and the people that take unconventional paths to find happiness at work and in life.
So today's guest is Michael Wacholder. Michael has had a wonderful, wonderful career that started with being actually one of the key peoples and scratch all that. Today's guest is Michael Wacholder. Michael is a wonderful person who actually hired me to run the business incubator at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. And so he was my boss for a long period of time. And so you're going to learn many things about him and myself in this conversation we had, because it was two old friends getting together and talking about life and how life can change and how life goes on. Mike has had a great career, and he was one of the key individuals in the formation of and the evolution of technology parks, incubators, accelerators, and the entrepreneurship efforts that happen at universities. So this was a long conversation, and we're going to do this in two parts. So this week we're releasing part one, where we're going to focus on tech parks, incubators, accelerators, entrepreneurship, a few other topics. And then next week we'll release part two, where we're going to talk about being a lifelong learner, how to be a good boss, the role of mentors, both being a mentee and a mentor, and how life can all of a sudden change. So let's jump right into part one of my conversation with Mike Wacholder. Hello, listeners. Bela here. Today I am here with absolutely one of my favorite persons. Only one of my favorite persons, but the best damn boss I ever had in my whole career. And I've had a lot of bosses. I'm here today with Mike Wacholder, who hired me into RPI to run the business incubator probably close to 20 years ago now, if not more. And Mike has been a great inspiration to many people. He's helped many entrepreneurs. He's been pivotal in the university-based technology park industry, the university-based incubator industry, and just a great all-around person. So I thought he'd be a wonderful, wonderful person to interview today. So welcome to the show, Mike.
Thank you. Thank you for such a nice introduction. You always say that about me being your best boss. I still don't believe it, but I'm flattered. I'm very much flattered.
Well, you should be flattered, but don't let it go to your head, because it's not a high standard.
I do have a comment maybe later as to what makes a good boss. Why you probably say what you say.
Well, say it now. This is a good place to start. Go ahead, dive into that.
Because I've been thinking about that, because I suspected you'd bring it up again. And I don't think I ever for a day thought about Bela as my employee, or as I thought about me as his boss. It was what made us work, and what made it work so well was because we were colleagues, and constantly colleagues, without any hierarchy. And I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it immensely. And it became sort of one of the standards I used to apply to people I like to work with. I don't want to work as boss and employee. I want to work with colleagues. And Bela exemplifies that. We had a lot of fun.
Yeah, we sure did, and I think that was a great characterization of how that relationship existed. And I think back upon the many different jobs I've had, and there's a few times where it really just clicks for whatever reason, right? The right chemistry, the right personalities, the right environment, all of those things. And they're pretty few and far between. And certainly when we work together on a daily basis, it was wonderful. So Mike, you had an illustrious career, and you were pivotal in founding university-based technology park and a university-based incubator, business incubator. So for those folks who might not know what a tech park is, could you expound on that a little bit?
Well, a tech park, simply stated, is a place for technology. In our case, and many cases since then, and even a few before then, is a place for university-connected technology. The university being a major draw to the park for companies that want to lean on the university's expertise, its research, its students, and its faculty. And we were dedicated to building those connections. And I think that's the underlying factor that made our project so successful. It's that simple. So we began to attract many companies, but we also began to grow companies. And that was something we didn't really think of until we were exploring the feasibility of the tech park. And one of our trustees, actually two of them, we had a committee of trustees overseeing the park and helping to determine if it's feasible. But they both said, we're on the threshold here of committing millions of dollars in the building of a tech park. We have to find a way for far less money to test the concept, to validate the concept. And they toyed around with that, and one of those two guys, actually Harry Apkarian, who's a local legend and an entrepreneur, and for me a wonderful mentor. Anyway, he suggested the idea. He says, look, why don't we create an incubator? Why don't we look at the campus, find technologies that look like they'll work in the marketplace, and help foster those technologies and the people surrounding them into a business. And everyone jumped on that as a great idea. And they concluded that if the incubator worked, the technology the tech park will work. So they turned to me. I was frightened half to death because I barely knew what incubators were. And they said, Mike, get it going. And so I got it going. I turned to the university and got a couple of people to work with me. Ray Lancaster, one of them who was our treasurer and a genius, and Pierre Abeti, another one who was a faculty member and former GE guy, a faculty member in teaching management, and we had the core of it. And me, I'm a bricks and mortar kind of guy. So the three of us, then we added more and more people, but we got the program going, and as a small committee, and we jumped on a few ideas, on a few people at the university with ideas, a couple of students in one case, some faculty in other cases, and suddenly, before we could turn around, the incubator was flourishing, and I was becoming frantic to find enough available space on campus. Part of the success of our incubator was the location of the incubator had to be close to or on the campus so that the connection really worked. You could leave your classroom and walk to your business. And we expanded from a piece of one building to a piece of another building, et cetera, until we really knew we had something good. And then we found a home for the incubator right on the edge of campus.
And what year? Well, first of all, let's put this into context. I'm not sure if we mentioned this or not, but this was at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, also known as RPI. And what year did the whole tech park thing kind of start up?
Well, it started up two ways. Number one, a rather extensive, timely, or long-term effort to determine its feasibility. That included getting the incubator going, and then 2, when we broke ground. And the feasibility study started maybe in 1979. I think it was actually January 79. Started talking about it in late 78. That's 1978, 79. That seems right now like a long time ago. And the incubator was really born in 1980. So there's your time frame.
Okay, excellent. And so as you were, let's take a step back. So that sort of puts the context for the overall conversation we want to have here. But I want to take the clock back to Michael Wacholder in high school. So what was Michael Wacholder like in high school? Were you always entrepreneurial driven? Did you sort of is there entrepreneurship in the family?
If you want me to be honest, or you want me to tell fibs?
The microphone doesn't know which one you're doing. Only you do.
In short, I'll sum it up by saying I was a naive nerd, a real nerd. I wasn't really focused on any kind of career. Entrepreneurship was a term that I didn't even have in my vocabulary at the time.
Probably hadn't been invented yet.
Yeah, and had it been, I wouldn't be able to spell it. So in some respects, but even when I go back and reflect on my childhood, I did do things that you would classify as entrepreneurial. Little jobs. I have an uncle who lives in Walnut Creek, California, and a very successful developer. And Walnut Creek, you could guess, got its name from walnut trees. And my dad, we lived on a peninsula in San Mateo, across the bay from Walnut Creek. And my dad would drive us over to Uncle Dave's place, and me and my brother and a few neighbors would go, and we'd pick walnuts all day long. And then we'd bring them back to our house, and we'd husk them all day long another day, and put them in paper bags, and then we'd go around the neighborhood and sell them. And the trademark of our success was, if you ever mess around with a walnut, it has, over the shell of a walnut is a green husk, and we had to take that husk off, and it stains anything it touches, including your hands. And we had green hands for weeks. But that was one of my early entrepreneurial endeavors. And another thing we did was, in where I lived in San Mateo, kind of a real suburban community, streets, curbs, and sidewalks. One thing that people used to do is paint on the face of the curb and the top of the curb their address. So we went out and bought stencils, and we would go up and down the block and the block next to us and all around, and we would sell, the ability, we would paint addresses on people's curbs. That was another money maker we did. I could probably come up with more, but I hadn't thought about those two things for years.
Oh, that's great. Those are great stories. Lots of people I talk to and interview on this podcast, many of them have stories like that from their childhood, where they took the initiative for something and they made something out of it. Whether they made money at it or not doesn't matter. That's not the point. But they sort of took the initiative and they did something with that initiative. They took the first step and they acted and they moved in that direction. And they had something at the end that they could point to and as an accomplishment. So what happened after high school?
After high school, I got admitted to the University of California at Berkeley, and I was just thrilled about that. But I hadn't entirely lost my naive nerd self-image, and I didn't do very well at all. And Cal, they used to say, and it scared me to death, was that look to your left, look to your right, and one of those people on either side of you will flunk out. Well, I was on somebody's left or somebody's right, and I did very poorly. I got all caught up in the freedoms of university life.
So what year was this at Berkeley?
1960.
So it's sort of the apex of a lot of things to get caught up in.
But again, remember, I was a nerd, and I was in the middle of the free speech movement, And I was so nerdy, I didn't understand it very well. And now as I look back and I reflect on that, those guys, the free speech movement in those days, they changed the world. They really made a difference, and now I understand it. But anyway, so it was a very liberal place, brilliant people, and a couple of nerds. And so from there, I was humiliated. It was a life lesson, though. If you ask me what's the most important life lesson you ever had, I would say probably having to leave Berkeley and go to a local community college, which I did. And I suddenly grew up. And I went to the community college and excelled there. Got all A's. And I did so well for 1 year of school, I got a scholarship back to Cal. And then at that time, I discovered what I wanted to do. And Cal had a wonderful program in landscape architecture, and I enrolled in that, and there was no looking back ever since.
So what was that, did that desire to do landscape architecture, did that come at a moment, or was that a result of you being exposed to that in some way, or sort of how did that epiphany happen?
Good question. I wish I knew. Part of it was because architecture was too dependent on strong math skills at the time, and I knew I couldn't survive that. And so landscape architecture was not, and it just looked good. But also I've always had an admiration and a love and a fascination with the natural environment. And I was attracted to it as soon as I discovered that there was really a curriculum about it. And as a kid, I worked in landscape work, and so I was familiar with a lot, grounds maintenance and planting things and all that. So it came natural, and I loved it.
Yeah.
I loved it, and there was no looking back. I was mature, and I did very well from there on.
And so then you graduated from Cal, or Berkeley as it's also known, and then what happened?
Well, then I lived in San Mateo, my family did, and at the time I was living in Berkeley, and during that period, it was really a period of new town development. They were springing up around Washington, D.C. and around California, and right adjacent to San Mateo was this new town, a city called Foster City, and that was literally being just in the beginning stages. And I was lucky. I got a job with the engineering firm that was located in the middle of that new town, in the only office building that was there. And they were the firm that was designing and overseeing construction of Foster City. And that was my first job. It was wonderful, participating in the development of the city.
So are these like, help me understand this a little bit, are these sort of like planned communities, planned cities?
Totally. And I occasionally when I'm in California, I'll go there. It's totally built. It has a population exceeding, I think, 30 or 40,000 people. And it's wonderful, to think that you were there when it was mostly dirt. So it was very well, every inch of it was planned. And it was right on the shores of San Francisco Bay. And the whole storm drainage system was based upon building canals throughout Foster City. So most of the homes had a canal in their backyard, and the canals functioned as the stormwater system that could drain into the bay. So it was quite clever from an engineering point of view, and I learned a lot. I also learned how to work, because then suddenly you're accountable for your time. Time is money, and you learn real quick when your boss says, "Why isn't that done yet?" And I can remember a few of those, and I really, I learned a lot. So let me go on from there because I know what you'll ask next. While there, I worked with two guys that stood out. One guy was director of the planning department, and the other guy, as I recall, was an engineer. And suddenly they left the company, and I was shattered, because they were great mentors. And they went to a university in Texas called Texas A&M University to develop. They were invited to come there and to start a master's program in planning, urban and regional planning. So as they prepared to leave, I said, hey guys, be honest, we're friends. So if you got something going that's really good, I would like to join you. I've always dreamed about a master's degree in planning because that's the logical extension of landscape on a larger scale. And I'll call you. Let's see how it's going. And they responded they'd love to have me. And about a year later, I was working in San Francisco for a famous architect, John Carl Warnke. Probably no one around anymore that knows of him, but in his day, he was the big banana. And that was pretty, most people, my friends and family, thought that was a real career-enhancing opportunity. And it was a Monday. I got a call from these two guys. They're on the phone. They said, Mike, where are you? I said, what do you mean where I am? I'm sitting in San Francisco at the office. And they said, you're supposed to be here. And I said, what do you mean? He said, you're enrolled for this semester. It's already started. You're not there. You're late. I said, well, you must have told everybody but me. And it was a Monday. And they said, if you can get here by Thursday, we can keep you in the program for this semester. So I went home and told my wife I quit Warnke's firm. Pack me up, I'm leaving, and you quit your job and join me as soon as you can. And I flew off to Texas A&M, and that was cultural shock. I had no idea Texas A&M was a military school. I had no idea what Texas looked like in the middle of winter. It was just, I can always remember looking out the window and everything was brown from the plane. But anyway, it was a wonderful opportunity to be in there. And I did a lot there besides going to school. I got working with the provost on campus planning for the university. And then he got a grant for the A&M system to write guidelines for the whole system. If you look on that wall right there, Bela, is a flyer for a book he and I wrote about guidelines for planning in universities. And so I did that. I worked on my master's degree. And I worked for a local planner designing subdivisions. So I was a busy boy, but I was doing what I loved. You couldn't hold me back. And I was developing an expertise in land design and in, land, I had it in my head a minute ago. But I developed some interesting, and planning in general.
And in a university environment too, right? Which is slightly different than the public sector, which is different than the private sector.
Yes, indeed, you're correct.
Yeah.
So it was a unbelievable experience, and our book was very successful. And around the book, the A&M system sponsored a conference for all the schools to talk about principles in planning. And so myself and the provost were the main presenters, and people came from all over the country. One guy that came was the head of a big effort in New York State at the time, which was the late 60s, a guy named Tony Adinolfi. And he was Governor Rockefeller's man to build the SUNY system, the State University of New York. And he ran a design, a system that designed and built either new universities in a system or significantly expanded universities in the system. And he came up to me and we introduced each other, and he said, would you come to New York and consider working for me? I said, I don't know about that, but I'd love to go to New York. And so a couple of weeks later, I flew to New York, and I met him, and I'll never forget that interview, and it was wonderful. And he had, as we were talking, sitting on his desk in front of him was my book. And for some reason, it was turned to the title page. And on the title page was my name and the provost's name. And my name was circled in red. I never forgot that. So I figured I had a pretty good chance on the job. And in its day, it was called the State University Construction Fund, and it was the hottest architectural and development program in the country. A multi-million-dollar program. Actually, as I recall, a $2 or $3 billion investment by New York State.
Expansion. Yeah.
And I was in charge at the time when I took the job for the planning, campus planning, on 16 of the then 32 campuses. So that was a great experience.
And geographically, where was this located?
In Albany.
In Albany. So you
I
go
moved
from
to Albany.
You go from California and Berkeley and San Mateo, was it?
Yep.
To Texas. Texas A&M is where?
In Bryan, Texas, and College Station.
College Station, which is sort of...
It's a little tiny town, and it was really something.
Yeah, from there.
But one thing I learned is universities are universities, and the university environment is a rich, intellectual, challenging environment. And then from there, I went to Albany, New York, which was still in the post-industrial era of decaying industry, and that was a shock too. But to be associated with Tony Adinolfi and this enormous initiative of New York State, and in campus planning, I couldn't have asked for more.
So, just, as I reflect back on what you've said here in the last few minutes, is you were part of one of the first towns that sort of starts with a blank sheet of paper and gets developed. And we're not talking a 100-unit housing development. We're talking about a whole city, right? From there to Texas A&M to build out a whole program there and work there and write a book. So then...
Oh, but I didn't say one of my responsibilities while there was developing a master plan for Texas A&M.
In addition to the expansion and
the big study.
Yeah. And then to Albany, New York, to help state of New York expand their state university system.
Yep.
So you were really involved in a lot of firsts.
Well, I guess. I doubt I thought of it that way in the day, but reflecting back, you're absolutely right.
Yeah, so you were a real pioneer in those types of university build out, and the engagement of the university with the business community.
Very important point. And that particularly became important as we developed the RPI Park.
So how'd you end up at RPI from the State University?
You're always ahead of me, Bela. That's why we work so well together. I always knew, but I'd never admit how much smarter he was than I. But anyway, when I was interviewing with that man, Tony Adinolfi, my first ever trip to New York, I was sitting there, I said, you know something, while at A&M, which I didn't mention to you yet, I had the opportunity to teach architecture. And I worked with other faculty teaching design, and I loved it. And I said, it's something that's in me, you know. And are there any schools of architecture in this area that I could affiliate with? And he said, are you kidding? RPI is here, the best school of architecture in the Northeast. I said, what's RPI? I shouldn't say this, but it's honest. I never heard of RPI as a smart aleck Californian, where you think the whole world revolves around the state and the university there. Anyway, he said he got on the phone immediately, called a few people, and called his driver, and had me chauffeured to RPI that afternoon to meet the Dean of Architecture and a few of the faculty. And that started a relationship with RPI, which became a teaching opportunity, and that became eventually a full-time opportunity, where I worked with the Dean of Architecture, and we did a master plan for RPI, and remember, this is in the, let's think about this, the early 70s, I guess, when RPI was looking at growth, but none of the current campus, the new things were there then. And so we developed a master plan for RPI. Me and this other professor who became dean, who was one of the guys I met that day I was sent over to campus. And that teaching relationship was for several years.
So interesting. That was our first overlap, because I was at RPI. I graduated in 75 and 76. So I'm not sure I ever realized this before, but you were there when I was a student there.
Luckily, you didn't take any of my courses.
I wasn't an architect. I remember those were all the people walking around with cardboard models of everything under their arms.
But by then, I might have been teaching. We had a program, a graduate program there in urban and regional planning, headed up by a guy named Paul Zuber, a local legend. And Zuber wanted me to teach for him. So my teaching in architecture evolved by the middle 70s into becoming a standard course I offered in his curriculum in planning. And that was very interesting. That was a good opportunity, more growth, more experience in the broader world of planning. Now I'll tell you one quick story, and then I think I'm taking too much of your time. I also got involved at RPI in some administrative work. And while that's always a challenge, it wasn't me, as you could tell from all the things I had been doing. And I didn't like it one bit. So the vice president at the school was a pretty good friend of mine then. And I went to him one day and I said, "Alan, I'm leaving. I can't take it. This is administrative work." And he says, "Oh my God." He says, wait a minute. Promise just to hold your thoughts for a couple of weeks. And I'll get back to you because something's cooking. You're the guy." I said, "All right, I'll give you a couple of weeks," but my mind is pretty well made up. And later on he called me. He said, "Mike, I want you to see the president of RBI." And the president then was George Lowe, the famous George Lowe, the man who was a key contributor to putting man on the moon. And just to be called into his office is a career highlight. And when I got in there, he told me about this idea he had to build a tech park on land owned by the university in a nearby town, North Greenbush, where RPI owned 1,200 acres. And by the time he got done telling me this image, this vision he had, I bought in. It was terrific. And he asked me if I would do, for him, I would do a feasibility study of the concept of a tech park on his 1,200 acres of land. And I said, "It sounds very exciting. I'd be delighted. And that will keep me here at RPI." And then I'll never forget, even though we're taping this and you can't see me, he sat in his chair and he shook his finger at me. He said, "But Mike, it's only a 6-month appointment. Get it done in 6 months." And I said, "Okay, that's 6 months longer before I have to make a move." And that grew into roughly a 30-year experience building the park, the incubator, and entrepreneurship programs on campus. That meeting with George Lowe. And in those days, to work for George Lowe, that was a career opportunity few people ever had. And he was a real leader and a real spark plug. So anyway, now I'm still on campus, but I'm developing a master plan and a feasibility study for the tech park. And that took about a year. Mm-hmm. And I worked with a group, a committee of trustees. Actually, George was a really smart guy. It was a committee of trustees and representatives from the student body, representatives of the alumni body, and representatives of the faculty. And we put together a plan. And during that time was when the incubator was invented, literally invented by Harry Apkarian and Ken Lally. So if any people are listening to this who are local and have been around for a while, those two names will bring you back, Apkarian and Lally. And out of that feasibility study and wanting to test the feasibility of an expensive idea, the incubator was born. So the rest is sort of history, and my 6 months turned into a 30-year experience.
And when you retired a few years ago, bridge us from 30 years ago when there was, how many acres did you say?
1,200.
1,200 acres of vacant land, basically, to what the tech park is now. Can you describe the tech park in some sort of set of parameters for us?
What it is now or what it was then?
What it is now. What it was then was just vacant land, right?
I'll struggle a little bit here because I've been away from it now for 7 or 8 years. But the park, the topography of the park is magnificent. It's on an upland area, rolling hillsides, upland of the Hudson River. But between the Hudson River, there's a little bit of land, 100 acres or so, that's marsh and floodplain. And then it suddenly rises up in a very steep escarpment, and then it levels off, and it's kind of rolling hills and lots of forest. And so there were huge limitations on what we could do on those 1,200 acres. We couldn't touch the wetlands. We couldn't touch the hillside, the escarpment. And there are ravines working their way down to the river, very steep and deep and wooded ravines. And it's those physical factors of the site that really sort of dictated the plan for the campus, the tech park campus. And so the tech park kind of weaves and dodges between those ravines on those upland slopes and beautiful lands there. And we made a real effort, and part of that I think is my background in wanting to preserve beautiful oak forests and not touch ravines. And so we had designated lots of areas around the park as untouchable, and then other areas that began to define itself as development zones. And so when you drive around the park now, it's still characterized by lots of woods and trees, and just a beautiful sense of environment. And we tried really hard to preserve that. And if you run into any people that knew me back then, they'll tell you real crazy stories about me and about my obsession with the trees and how they couldn't touch a tree unless I gave them permission. And there's some trees that, that are still there that people wanted to take that I dedicated to some of the trustees that I worked with. But anyway, long story, but I don't know if that, you really have to drive through it to get the feel. But it feels like a park.
Yeah.
Rensselaer Technology Park is a place for technology, a park place for technology. And it was really a combination of both.
And here again, you were doing this in the late 70s when it wasn't standard practice to save all the trees. And basically standard practice in those days was to go in and level everything and
including some of the ravines.
And fill in the ravines and, make a nice level piece of land and build. So you're out in the forefront there again. So go ahead, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I mean, to call that the forefront, and maybe you're right. But to me, it was just a logical, proper thing to do.
Yeah.
To respect the environment and to share it, in a planned way with the people that are inhabiting the area. So they both could too. The two could beautifully coexist.
And sort of, how big is the tech park now? Number of square feet under roof, or however you
I'm too far away. I'm too far away. When I left, it was about 1.25 million square feet. And I think the park proper occupies about 500 or 600 of the 1,200 acres.
Mm-hmm.
And designated open space was at least 300 or 400 acres.
Yeah. So that's it for part 1. Hope you enjoyed the conversation with Mike Wacholder. Mike Wasserman and I will do our typical wrap-up at the end of part 2, which we will release next week. We're happy you joined us for our podcasting adventure for this week. We hope you found the last hour interesting and thought-provoking. We have 2 small requests. If you have any questions about what we discussed, suggestions about the topics or potential guests, get in touch with us. Our email address is bela.and.mike@gmail.com. Hey, and if you like what we're doing, hit the subscribe button on your podcasting app. It's free. Or even better, hey, tell one of your friends you really enjoy this and get them to listen as well. Signing off from upstate New York. Hey, Mike, see you next week.
Hey, thanks, Bela. I'm really looking forward to part 2. That's it from over here in Münster, Germany. Have a great week.
This podcast is produced for Mike and I by our friends at Busy Media of Schenectady, New York. They can be found at busymedia.co.